proceedings, and as soon as the hearing is closed, please leave quietly. My name is Deputy Hilary Jearn, and I'm the Chair of the Environment, Housing and Infrastructure Scrutiny Panel.
Deputy Tom Coles, Vice Chair.
Deputy David Wall, panel member.
Deputy Alex Curtis, panel member.
Constable David Johnson, panel member.
Deputy Sam Mesek, Minister for Housing.
Natasha Day, Head of Strategic Housing and Regeneration.
Thank you, Minister. We'll kick off today. You had an allocation of 522,000 in 2025, and this has risen to 632,000 in 2026, representing an increase of 21%. What is driving the 21% increase?
Sorry, could you just cite which lines in the budget that you're referring to there? Sorry, I might have missed part of that.
It's your allocation for 2025 was around 500,000, and this has risen by 21%. So you've got 632,000, I believe.
As ministerial allocation as opposed to departmental allocation.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm guessing that rises partly to do with the rent tribunal, I would have thought.
So
then that goes to just
yeah,
reserve,
I mean, to be honest, it's difficult to. I hadn't picked up that slight nuance. The Minister for Housing's actual budgets of his own have not changed, so it will only be pay award inflation as standard across all other departments. And then there's the residual amount after minusing the £90,000, which is a budget transfer, which is the tribunal. So it could be that difference between the total sum of the tribunal business case minus the 90,000.
So your budget is similar to 2025?
Yes.
Thank you. What priorities, what projects are your department intending to deliver in the first half of 2026 using this financing?
Well, the establishment of the rent tribunal will be a big part of that. That's a consequence of the residential tenancy law. I think we'd hoped to have started that this year, but the law being debated later than we initially thought would happen means I think the bulk of that will probably happen at the start of next year.
Is that mainly, is there any other?
Well, in terms of projects, a lot of the rest of it is the stuff I'm already doing. It's not necessarily new things. So, I have the three pillars of my agenda on home ownership, improving experience for renting, and addressing the plight of homelessness. A lot of what I will do next year will be the continuation of that, and it may be different elements of that because we've got a bit further on down the line in that. But a lot of that is not resource intensive because a lot of that is policy changes, and a degree of that is having this policy instead of that policy, which doesn't always mean spending more.
No, of course, and if this is the focus of kind of business as usual, plus of course the rent tribunal, I believe there was some changes. There was some propositions that were passed related to work in your area from the States Assembly. Is that considered business as usual?
Yes, yeah. So things like the social housing rents review, but again, we don't know what that will lead to. There's still, we don't know. It may conclude with changes. It may conclude that tweaks ought to be made, or may conclude that the current system works well. We don't know yet, and we don't know whether it will be the democratic will of the Assembly to initiate any changes as a result of that. But we will have something to present that will be of interest for whatever we decide the next steps as a result are.
And I suppose that business as usual, you were mentioning the kind of three pillars, though RTL being one of those pillars. Now the addition as the rent tribunal, but the other two areas, is there anything that will be presentable to the Assembly between now and the end of the term? I mean, is anything that you will be bringing towards to the Assembly, or is it really kind of specific actions or kind of?
So we're kind of working at the moment in putting something together that says what I kind of more tangibly want next steps to be. So, one of the things I've done in this term of office has been expand social housing gateway eligibility criteria, for example. But I have said, every time I've ever been asked that I want to go further. So I want to be clearer about what the further is and what a timetable for that might look like. So presenting that kind of thing will be in the mix as well.
Okay. And because of course halfway through next year there will be the election, and then there potentially will be a new Minister for Housing. Is there any direction that will be set for the new Minister for Housing? I mean, is there? Was there any intention to? I'm wondering. I suppose what I'm asking is that maybe in other budgets past there have been specific projects that have been put in budgets that potentially other ministers have then taken up. Yourself being one of them, I believe.
Indeed, I was just thinking that.
So, why was then the idea of not bringing, the potential projects to the table? So to go after June 2026 as well.
Yeah, well, there's the Investing in Jersey programme, and that's kind of come out towards the, more towards the end of a term of office. The next government may wish to pick up some of that and run with it, or throw the whole thing in the bin, or what have you. It will depend on the democratic will of whoever is in charge of the next government, what they want to do. But the things that are part of my agenda, if and I'm not saying that this is what I'm aiming for, but if I happened to carry on as housing minister after the next election, or somebody with an identical agenda to me did, the way the budget is set up, they would be able to carry on doing that, because a lot of the things in my agenda are not things that are requiring budget increases in order to deliver. It's policy stuff that we use the team that we've had to go out and deliver.
And so, for example, one of the things that obviously fell off the agenda, but what had been a project, was empty homes and working on empty homes.
Yes.
Would that then potentially be able to be budgeted if a future minister came and decided that was something they wanted to do? Would the money be there to be able to do it within the business as usual money?
Next year, no, unless they decided to scrap an existing thing that they, for whatever political reasons, weren't keen, so that they would have to reallocate within what they'd already have, or they'd have to apply for it for the 27 budget if they were taking on an additional project like that needed more resource.
Okay, but you yourself, Minister, don't believe that within the housing minister's portfolio that the pillars, the three pillars that you've chosen, those are the ones that should continue, and they are there able to deliver on Jersey's housing crisis?
Yes, but with the caveat that if I were completely in charge, and the realities of how you budget things across the whole of government were less constrained than they are within the political compromises we all have to make, then there may well be more things that I'd want to pack into that. But that would involve having more people in the team to deliver on it. It would have to mean finding that budget from somewhere else. But within the agenda that I've set, I'm absolutely confident that this budget allows that to carry on exactly as I hope to do so. If we were talking ideal world where loads more money was available, yeah, I'd hire a load more people to take on some more projects. But that's parallel universe kind of thinking.
And in the Invest in Jersey, is it a project?
Programme.
Programme. That's the word. Would that then assign more money to the Minister for Housing in the future?
Not necessarily to the minister, because that talks about things. It talks about potentially doing more of First Step. That wouldn't sit, under a column that says Minister for Housing budget. That would be something that, if we're doing it the same way we did it last time, would go to Andy Holmes again. So, my budget as minister, you can see straight from the chart, looks very different to other ministers, and that's mostly because I just deal with a policy team. It's other entities that do the actual physically building stuff. So a lot of the things that are in Investing in Jersey, like potentially doing more First Step, that would be a budget that would end up somewhere else. My team would be setting the policy, and it's the same people, irrespective in that.
Yeah, I suppose my last question is, and you've made it clear, your team is about policy setting, and I suppose, is there, just to understand and explain to the scrutiny panel, obviously, has there been, do you have regular discussions about whether the direction of that policy needs to be changing depending on the environment that we've seen ourselves 2 years ago now since you became minister? Yeah. Is there need to be a reset, a rethink with those policy decisions and directions? And when does that happen? And
I regard that as always happening. And the social housing eligibility is a really I think, easy example to use there, because that, you know, that does depend where we are in a particular moment, where we are with supply, what current gateway statistics look like, and the judgment will come based on that, but that evaluation is happening all the time. So in terms of the agenda that I have, those kind of considerations are constantly made.
And with that in mind, then do you feel, and of course not being in an ideal world, unfortunately, do you feel that the proposed expenditure is sufficient to ensure adequate resources are available for these kind of policy directions? And
100% yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pass over to Conatable.
Yes, I've already referred to the question of rent tribunal and a few general questions regarding that. The report to P24 estimated annual costs of 130,000 for the rent tribunal, whereas in the budget estimate there's an ongoing annual revenue cost of 40,000 with additional annual transfer of 90,000 to me from the Employment, Social Security and Housing Department to the Cabinet Office. Can you confirm these figures are correct, first of all, and explain why the transfer is being made through the Cabinet Office rather than directly to the judicial graph?
Natasha might be able to do the second part of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
A second, yeah. So the £90,000 was it came about in a budget from 2021. The business case is 2021. The money landed for 2022. That was around the time that the first attempt at establishing a rent tribunal was taken forward under the Dwelling Houses Rent Controls Law in 1946. An employee was taken on to support that work at the time, and the employee was brought into SPPP or Cabinet Office, but the budget was actually established for some reason, I think on best judgment of the day, to exist within customer and local services as it was at the time. So there's always been a mismatch between where the budget has existed and where the employee is actually employed and managed and providing their day-to-day services. So it's always been on the agenda to correct that budget allocation. It's actually taken a bit longer than I'd hoped. I think when I first started in my role, it was one of the first things I wanted to address, and it's taken till now. So I think there's a timing issue that the correction of the budget allocation is first of all being addressed, and then when the rent tribunal is ready to be effectively switched on, and there'll be an employee transfer that happens at that time, then the budget moves with the employee, and the residual budget between the FTE pay and the total budgeted amount will go into the GREF's budget to manage the tribunal. So there's a slight difference there between those two things.
I guess this is almost a holding measure then, is it really?
It's correcting the situation and making sure that the budgets are in the right place, and then it will only move when it's the right time to move. We don't want to see that money moving prematurely, otherwise my team's budget will have a shortfall to pay for the employee that we have.
Okay, thank you for that then. And does the funding allocation for 2026 include any flexibility for an influx of initial cases? I mean, there's an assumption that there might be 3 cases, is it, per month or?
On that, when we developed the business case, we did work very closely with the GREF, and we identified as many sources as we possibly could, but ultimately there is no precedent for a modern rent tribunal under the legal provisions that have been newly created. So it is only assumptions, largely drawn from interactions with citizens' advice. We allowed a small contingency. We arrived at a number and allowed a contingency above that number to give us an estimate of cases, but it is nothing short of an estimate. We won't know until the tribunal is in action as to how many cases really do come forward.
So is there any further modelling going to take place to get a better estimate?
I don't think it's possible because these are wholly new legislative provisions. We've only been able to plan ways to mitigate any negative consequences of an estimate that's off the mark. So the transitional provisions are key in that they serve many purposes. The way that we've designed the transitional provisions, one of the key benefits is that people will have a gradual move to the legislation depending on the tenancy type that they have and what they agree with their landlord, which will give a slow entry of the number of cases that could could be subject to a rent tribunal over what we expect to see as being perhaps a 5-year period would cover most tenancies which might be on fixed terms.
Well, thank you again for that. But in case volumes do rise beyond what you've been able to anticipate, is the department able to fund the increase, or will there be a problem in actually hearing the many cases that are required?
I mean, that has been an area of concern for the judicial graph. Obviously, they don't want to be short. There are some natural consequences if the tribunal were to find itself to be overwhelmed above the number of cases, or significantly above the number of cases that had been estimated, that you would see a backlog start to form in terms of cases being heard, and therefore a resultant delay in the conclusion of cases, which we don't want to see. But as I say, because we have a gradual transition to the legislation, we should start to see cases rising over a period of time and have early warning if we think that actually we're getting to the point that we built the business case assumptions and we don't yet think we've fully transitioned to the law. Therefore, it's likely that the case may be insufficient. We also have to account for the fact that this is new legislation and people will be testing the provisions of the law early on. They might be already dissatisfied and ready to, if they believe that their landlord is behaving in a way that's unlawful, that they could use the tribunal and they may be more active. It may be that people are slower to use it. So there's so many different assumptions on people's behaviour and how they're going to respond to the law that it really does make it impossible to reliably estimate. But we can only assure you that we've done our best based on the information that we could have made available to us, and that as a team we are committed to continuing to work with the judicial graph and manage any new business case requirements as they arise. But I think to answer your point, is there any scope in terms of overspend, if you like, that between housing budgets there is no scope. The budget within the Cabinet Office is fully spent on staff costs, as the Minister has explained. We are a policy function. And within the State's graph budget, that is a question that you would have to ask of the judicial graph as to their budget flexibility at year end.
Yes, so what you say then, the final burden will lie on the judicial graph, that they were the ones that would not be able to implement the additional cases? And
as it is with any other tribunal that they manage, they adopt that service and they are ultimately responsible for its management. And if a business case is required, if it were any other tribunal, they would be, if they thought their business case, their current budget allocation was insufficient, they would be looking at a growth business case. I think the difference that we have with the tribunal that we're looking to create is that we have a long-term commitment to continue working with the graph to make sure that this isn't an additional burden on them. We know that they are a small and busy team, and we are committed to working with them and supporting them, and if it means writing another business case with them, we would be looking to do that. But at this stage, I don't think there's any strong indication that would be necessary.
And leading on to, again, it's the interaction between yourselves and judicial graph, will the graph therefore be responsible for the budget oversight, or will that be yourselves?
The graph.
Graph. Okay. All right. Thank you. And last area of questioning really is the panel understands that the implementation of the residential tenancy law will require additional enforcement and compliance work by officers within the Environment Minister's Department. What assessments has he made of the staffing resource requirements to fulfil those enforcement duties, or would you say that is for the Environment Minister to determine?
Well, our teams have obviously been constantly in communication because we haven't wanted to design something that runs the risk of overwhelming the service and causing exactly the kind of problems that you're alluding to could happen. So the whole thing has been built and budgeted based on a lot of work between my team and the Environment Minister's team as well to co-produce some of that. And as you saw through the process of putting that law together, policies did evolve over that because of feedback and how things how it was deemed things might end up playing out. So that there has been a reasonable degree of collaboration on that to get to a point where we can be confident we'll be all right.
And on funding of any additional resources required, would that be down to the Environment Minister or yourselves, given that it's your...
For that, I would have thought that would be the Environment Minister, and we'd want to talk about it obviously as it's happening.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on at which point in time you're looking at. I mean, the immediate transition to the law, I think that all of the conversations that we'd had up and towards the back end of lodging was that the team would be capable of managing this, because it very much reflects what they do on a day-to-day basis. That whilst there's a lot of legislative change, there were some isolated changes that would actually have an impact on what they do on a day-to-day basis. The more substantive change is the regulation-making power to pass over powers of investigation and enforcement to regulation, which they were very keen to have, because at the moment their ability to investigate and conclude cases is limited because they don't have the VARIs. They have to work with the police, and it would make it a better place to have them in control of that. But we've reflected, based on their current capacity issues, that now is not the right time to be progressing that secondary legislation. I think the intent was to bring it forward along a quite close pace of the enactment of the legislation. But that's now not likely to happen. It's going to be second order. So the switch on of the law with the structural requirements of the tribunal order and establishing a tribunal are the first priority, which we're looking to deliver before the pre-election period. Second order would be working with the team in regulation to design and consider the best timing for any extension of their powers of investigation and wider enforcement of the law. That's where the substantive change would come.
So again, just to clarify, it is the extension of powers that would cause the additional burden on them beyond that which you already discussed. Is that what you're saying?
So again, I think that their reflections directly to me have always been that this is not much beyond business as usual. They would actually prepare cases for prosecution anyway, but it would firmly place any obligation onto them, which would be a material change, in legal terms certainly. And as I said, we just want to make sure that was carefully considered as to their readiness to take that responsibility on, which we have decided now is not the right time. We've got to focus on getting the law switched on and the tribunal established as that first order priority.
Okay, so obviously nothing within the present budget to cover that.
No.
It's not necessary, so as you were saying.
And does that mean then the discussions that we've had, because we've just had the Environment Minister hearing, and he made it very clear that there is very limited money within his budget. In fact, there's a reduction which would mean an impact on especially staff and new posts or filling post vacancies, which obviously has a direct impact on any implementation of this new law, depending on what happens with staff. And so does that mean that really these kind of secondary legislation and that kind of more focus with that has to be with their department would be more for the 2027 budget rather than for 2026? So we're seeing like that delay because of that situation.
Well, I wouldn't say it was a delay because of that. I think it's as the Minister said before, we keep these situations live and open and re-evaluate based on the current circumstances. And I think it's quite clear that they are feeling pressure within their team, and I think probably that the choice to not expedite that regulation making power is probably more about the additional loading it creates for them just to think about that. So their own process design and supporting the policy team in developing the proposals creates an overhead for them above their day job, and that they have to focus on their regulatory activities. So I think that's where let's slow that bit down a little bit, give them the space to get on with their core regulatory activities, and we will that place the regulation making power in the second order to the tribunal.
I think we clarified that expense such there is will be in 2027, so it's out the scope of this budget. Yeah.
Thank you. So Deputy Coles.
Thank you. Minister, the budget notes that the affordable housing purchase scheme and the 99-year loan fund are being closed, with remaining balances transferred to the dwelling houses loan fund. Why have these housing-related funds been consolidated, and what assessment has been made of the potential impact on homeowners or future housing support schemes?
The short answer to that is that basically both of those funds don't particularly get used much these days, and it just seems smarter to consolidate them into a single fund that can still meet those purposes if it needs to. There was a recommendation previously from the Fiscal Policy Panel about looking at the myriad of different funds that government has and assessing whether they are still meeting their stated purposes, and looking at these ones generally not. I think the most recent use of the 99-year lease one was the issue with the balconies at some of the flats at Lekeneve, but that can all be done by having it all consolidated into one fund. It just strikes us as making sense.
So you share the Treasury Minister's view that all these have fallen away, and that this shouldn't have any impact on future housing conditions?
Not even slightly,
Not
yeah.
even slightly, okay. With these funds now closed, are there plans to introduce a new and updated mechanism to support affordable housing ownership or access to finance in the future budgets or government plans?
Well, the Investing in Jersey programme alludes to that. That proposes setting up the Capital Investment Fund, which obviously hasn't happened yet, but it's our ambition to do that, and that will be a new way of doing things, not just for housing, but for other things as well. And so that and whatever exists on the periphery of that could be a way of doing that in the future. But in this term of office, we've obviously done the First Step scheme, and Andy managed that for us, and that proved to be a good way of doing that. So as a model, that serves as one we could continue to do into the future. So it may well be sticking with that, but if other options are politically pursued in the future, that can be done through the Capital Investment Fund or however we choose to do it then.
Okay.
Minister, we've talked a lot about the investment fund with the Minister for Infrastructure. Obviously, there's some really big ticket project items that he was wanting to see funded through the Climate Investment Fund, like the Shoreline Management Plan, potentially the change of the energy from waste plant. There's some big items there. You yourself are now mentioning that there are elements within the housing to fund some housing projects. How will it be structured so that these priorities, it feels like there could be is it an endless fund? It feels like it won't be an endless fund, and how do you prioritise?
That's all going to be down to future politics, because there's loads of different ways that you could get funding into that fund, and some of those ways will be more palatable to people of one political persuasion versus another. The document talks about generating surpluses and directing it to that fund. Well, there may well be competition for that if we end up in that situation. It talks about taking on borrowing to supplement that fund. Again, people have different political positions on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing or a prudent thing. And we could make cuts in government services and use that to reallocate the funding there, or we could do tax rises. Like, all of that is going to be down to politics. But the foundational point of the Capital Investment Fund as sitting legally where it will sit as being an easier mechanism to use than the existing ones means that whatever shape that future government takes will at least have a degree of freedom, more so than current and previous ones have had, to make those choices, what it chooses to do. The next government might decide that housing shouldn't be a top political priority for a while, in which case it won't get a look in that, but that will all be down to the politics.
So I want to continue this theme, talking about where funding for housing comes from, looking at both the housing bond, but ultimately the existing fund we do have to ring-fence the funding of social housing, which is the Housing Development Fund. Perhaps to draw from the earlier question, given the states have a well-established fund that can be used as a mechanism to fund and be ring-fenced for the funding of housing, how have you discussed with Council of Ministers the role of the Housing Development Fund in the context of the Jersey Capital Investment Fund during the planning for the budget and the in-principle set-up of the Capital Investment Fund?
So the HDF is fully drawn down at the moment, and I think since coming into office, the £10 million for First scheme that was held in reserves for that purpose. So we haven't had to open up a conversation about where any major funding may come from for a direct government initiative. The whole purpose of that fund is to develop new homes, which Andium are clearly very effectively getting on with. And you'll be aware, and I think you might even actually have your meeting with them today with Andium, that they have also taken out a private placement. So that's relieved the government of a need to perform a greater role in providing an extended housing development fund to the company, because they've managed to secure a good and appropriate deal with the private sector. So I think there just hasn't been any real reason to open up or question the future role of the HDF at this particular time. I said you need to be careful about the distinction and the purposes of the funds. The ones that we just spoken about is more likely where the minister would be looking if he were to have a policy initiative, because that would be about helping islanders directly with new initiatives. The HDF is very much about developing homes, and we don't develop homes ourselves, so there's no reason.
Notwithstanding the fact that funds sit with the Treasury Minister, enabling social housing providers to deliver the homes you want to see within the social housing market would seem to be a key priority of this government and probably the Housing Minister. So were any conversations taken as to whether the debt framework around the housing bond, the repayment, the last kind of consolidated debt framework publication, R61 2022, talks about seeing the Housing Development Fund grow in value from receipts. Did this budget look at all at trying to reinstill that so that you can help direct the social housing providers of the island to achieve that aim in the 26 to 29 period?
Yeah. So as far as I'm aware, that conversation hadn't been opened, and it's part of a long-standing sort of established expectation that Andium would look to the private sector. I think it was actually in P33 that there would be a combination of government finance and private finance. So they are playing out the intended course for funding. I think if it was felt beneficial, or substantially beneficial, as opposed to securing their private placement, then that conversation could have been opened. I'm personally not aware that conversation had been opened, and as I said, it's something that is running well, running as intended. There's just been no reason to reopen the conversation about its future role or extension at this time, because Andium have adequate funds secured to deliver their pipeline of projects.
Were there any requests from any of the social housing providers during 2025 to seek government loans using the established mechanisms that you had to consider and ultimately debate, or did no social housing providers contact the government for support in financing arrangements in 2025?
None that I think came to me.
So not directly relevant to the fund, again, as far as I am aware, because there is a possibility that some communication has gone directly into Treasury. There were some letters of comfort that had been called upon from social housing providers, that again being dealt with by Treasury, which are on historic letters of comfort over a certain percentage interest rate on historic arrangements with social housing providers. So Treasury have been dealing with some of those over the course of the last 2 years, I think, whilst the interest rate environment has been particularly high. But that's the only conversation that I'm aware of that's related to other social housing providers and financing relative to government support.
Okay, and the most recent position on when repayment of the £250 million housing bond is to start for the 2054 bond due date is 2034. Did you discuss with the Treasury Minister at any point in the year plans to bring that forward, plans to maintain that as part of the long-term, mid-term financial sustainability of ultimately confidence in funding social housing?
Again, not that I was involved in.
Yeah, so it's not a conversation that I have been directly involved with, although it is a conversation that I have had with Andy and Treasury, because I myself take interest in the original justification for the repayment period and what that means for Andium's return to government. Yeah. So the return to government has been a sticky area. It presents Andium with an ongoing challenge in terms of meeting or addressing their pressures that they face, whilst it is a structural element of income to the government. So I would say that there is a conversation that could be had around the long-term strategy, but it is not a conversation that has been had.
Okay.
Yeah, go for it. Okay, so the budget notes, pardon me, that consultation has been carried out on removing landlords' ability to claim interest deductions on residential rental properties, and that any ministerial decision will depend on market impacts. What are your views on the policy area?
Well, that originates from a amendment to a previous budget that I brought. It remains something that I'm philosophically aligned to. I think there is an inherent unfairness in homeowners having mortgage interest relief taken away from them, which I voted against doing, but maintaining it for investors in residential property. I think there's an inherent unfairness there. I can't morally justify it. But if you are going to change it, obviously you want to do a good job of it and do it properly. And so the Treasury Minister has led on that as a result of that budget amendment, but it's not concluded to a point of being able to enact one way or the other at this point.
Okay, thank you. So the budget also proposes a temporary reduction in the higher rate of stamp duty on non-main residence properties. In light of the current slowdown in the housing market, what are your views on that approach?
Mm-hmm. That's the majority view of the Council of Ministers. It's not a unanimous one. And it's not my view, which is why I will not muster up a defence for it, but it's the majority view of the Council of Ministers, and I support the budget as a whole.
Okay, fine. So the budget states that Andium's housing construction programme will add 583 new homes, including 253 family homes by the end of 2026. Given the impetus for...
28, I think.
Sorry, 2028, sorry, I misread it. Given the impetus for increasing supply, does Andium and the government have sufficient personnel with the right skills to support this level of production?
I certainly believe so. If it were 26, we wouldn't. Since it's 28, then I think that's manageable.
Yeah. Okay.
That obviously fits in line with their business plan. They're constantly updating me about pipeline. But, there's always inherent risk in all of those. You can easily have a project that you invest a lot of time and energy into getting to the point where you can make a reality, and then a curveball is thrown at you. You might get planning permission denied. You might have another thing that gets in the way of that, and all of that can be a risk. But things going as intended, I've got confidence that we've got the ability to meet those ambitions.
Could I just follow up on the stamp duty question that Deputy Moore asked? And you're in support of the budget in whole, but not of the stamp duty reduction. Did I hear that correct?
It's not something I personally welcome, but it's the majority view of Council of Ministers.
Could I understand how you've discussed this with the Council of Ministers and the Treasury Minister? And I say this because the Conataba and I sit on the Corporate Services Scrutiny panel, and I asked the Treasury Minister on the reduction of the stamp duty, and I'll just read it for... can I conclude on this section from what Mr Hackwell was saying? The finance is not the need for change. The stamp duty model is stable. To what extent of policy owned by the Housing Minister is this area owned by the Housing Minister, and is he in full agreement that this is the right step to take? The Treasury Minister says, I believe so. Mm-hmm. And I say, okay. How's that relationship working, that one panel can ask the Treasury Minister, is the Housing Minister supportive of quite a fundamental policy change in the budget? She believes yes. You're quite happy to say, I don't. I support the budget, but I don't support this area of policy. Mm-hmm. How did this area of debate go down in Council of Ministers, that we've got a minister with his own personal view or ministerial view, which he's allowed, but a Treasury Minister misinterpreting an area which she believes you both have the policy remit for, and she thinks you agree to, which you don't?
Well, I agree with the budget, and I'll vote for the budget irrespective.
This was a policy area on this that she believes.
I agree, but if you let me finish my sentence, I agree with the budget as a whole, and I will vote for the budget. And in the discussions that helped solidify the government's position on this, there were obviously strong and different views across the board. from different ministers, and there'll be some who will say that they support the policy position, even if it's not the one they would have chose. You know, some may well have wanted to have gone further on this, but they conclude that they would still support that policy position on it. In terms of the discourse that led to arriving at that decision, I was not a particularly what's the way of phrasing this? It was not the hill I was choosing to die on, and so I was not providing an amazingly robust argument one way or the other on it. In fact, my priority at the time was focusing on getting the residential tenancy law agreed in the States and all of the work that was happening with that. I don't know whether word reached the Treasury Minister in this. I may have said it around her or may not have. It's a policy choice that, if I were completely in charge, wouldn't be one that I would make, and therefore not one that I'll defend. But it's not a deal breaker. I still support the budget as a result of it. So, I'm not kicking up a stink about it.
Do you see kind of the challenge that states members might have here? We're given the view that the Treasury Minister sees this as your policy area, and she misinterprets perhaps what your policy preference would be. And members are trying to take confidence that ministers have kind of directions here.
Well, I didn't see that part of the hearing, but it sounds like you didn't ask her. Could you explain what you think the Housing Minister's policy preference would be? If she got tasked with that question, I'm sure she'd come up with a really interesting answer to it that I'd be keen to hear. But if it's framed specifically about one element of the budget, I don't know what I don't know what angle she was coming at from there. But yeah, the Treasury Minister and I are good friends, and we work very closely on lots of these matters.
A more general point on that situation, yes, the budget determines a change in rate, but that's not written in stone for the whole year. I mean, I'm right in thinking, am I not, that will be monitored by the Council of Ministers in the future, and if situation warrants it, we can reduce further, go back to what it was.
Yeah, but that's always the case.
Yes, I know what I'm saying. It's I want to get in perspective. This is it's not set for the year necessarily, is it?
As in set for the whole of 2026, we could change it halfway through. Is that what you're suggesting?
Can you change it?
I mean, that would be a bit more drastic than waiting for the ordinary moment of a next budget. But I suppose you could do that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I just want to carry on with your friend, the Treasury Minister. You've said that housing delivery is on track or progressing, yet the Minister for Treasury has publicly said we can't build more homes until the drainage issue is resolved. Why hasn't that constraint featured in your account of progress, and what's being done to address that?
Well, I think that'll be because I'll be generally leaving that to the Infrastructure Minister and Environment Minister, in whom I have full confidence in my friends in those portfolios as well to get on with that. And I support the Infrastructure Minister on that, and I've confidence that he'll see us through that, and we can resume as we intended.
You prefer the Treasury Minister to make comment in that area then?
Say that again, sorry.
You prefer the Treasury Minister didn't make commentary in that?
No, I enjoy every comment the Treasury Minister makes. It's always very enlightening.
So next question. So how will you ensure or enforce the minimum 15% of waterfront development properties to be deemed as suitable right-sized properties in accordance with P37/2024?
Yeah, so I'm frequently in dialogue with the State Jersey Development Company, who will lead on that, and we have various discussions as we go along about what kind of purchase schemes, not just the right sizing one, but other ones that we look into. It's fair to say that the waterfront one is not one that we're ready to put spades in the ground on. So we're not at a point of needing to absolutely determine the result of that in the short term. But there's thinking that they've begun to do on that about what kind of offers might look like, but we're not close to being at a point of needing to determine that.
And just in terms of actually monitoring that, so are there any mechanisms for monitoring compliance of these requirements?
As in legal compliance?
Yeah, or ways of making sure that the policy is being complied with.
Yeah, I mean, there'll be various stages to that, I would have thought. Through planning will be part of that. If they're coming forward with something that's non-compliant in one form or another, there'll be planning obligation agreements and sales going through court, and there'll be lots of opportunities to pick things up along the way if a mistake's being made or something's not being complied with.
That's basically how you do it. Okay. So what influence, if any, do you have over the design, mix and affordability of homes delivered by JDC?
Yeah, a reasonable amount. We speak frequently on that, and I've obviously been challenging them to go as far as possible when it comes to affordable options, and so we will frequently have dialogue about what a deposit saver scheme portion of those homes might involve, what the shared equity portion might involve. So I'm in frequent dialogue on that. But the shareholder of the SOJDC is ultimately the Treasury Minister, my good friend, the Treasury Minister.
Excellent.
There's questions that obviously because the Deputy asked about the mix of properties, and we're talking about housing mix a lot, especially within St Helier. So the question I've got around that is what data, what responsibilities do you have in understanding the housing requirements on the island and to encourage the better use of housing mix in these kind of developments?
Do you mean private sector ones as well? Or?
Yeah, and broadly as well.
Yeah, so I'm often asked for comment on planning applications when they come forward, and that includes private sector ones as well, on sites that maybe aren't quite as contentious as other ones, and we'll provide those comments, and we'll provide a view based on the type and mixture of homes on there, based on what data we've got about need. I'm think of examples in my head when private sector's looking to develop a site in town, for example. We get asked for comment on that, and if they're providing homes that don't look particularly well designed or livable in, I have occasionally made that comment to them to say, the way these are laid out, not quite sure that's going to be offering the quality of life that you might want people in town to have. So I provide official comments through that route.
But what's the data you gather? How do you gather the data to understand the housing need? That's
reported on largely by Statistics Jersey. So there's probably three core data sets, if you like. There's what we would call the objective assessment of housing needs. So the household housing need projections were produced the updated ones were produced by Statistics Jersey last year, and that models housing requirements by bedroom type over different population growth scenarios. It is based on demographic trends. So it's if the composition of the island and the trajectory of household sizes, ageing population, if that continues, plus migration, that's the requirement you will have. Of course, that's a policy off. So we have to account for other factors, which is both government policy and people's intentions. People's intentions will be influenced largely by affordability. And that gives us the second data set, which is the housing needs survey, which comes also from Statistics Jersey, but that is based on Joel's data largely, and some population assumptions. They sort of merge those things together a bit. And that gives us a more realistic, I think, outlook as to where housing demand might be pointing over the next sort of 3 years. It's a much shorter horizon, that one, because they want to keep it more certain. So what we saw in the last data set was that there's a higher demand for 2-bedroom houses, which we think is a symptom of 3-bedroom houses becoming less affordable and 2-bedroom flats not being the preference. So that the people have been noting a 2-bedroom house demand, which was something we hadn't actually really seen before. So and that then gets reflected in our comments on things like the rezoned housing sites, because we're seeing evidence of emergent demand for a house type that isn't provided for at a great level. And then the third data set is the island plan assumptions, and with that, the policy influences of the island plan and what it's trying to achieve. So island plan assumptions take those data sets and make a planning assumption that set the housing supply for the entire island plan over the period and as it is now beyond, because the population hasn't grown as fast. But it sets expectations for housing mix around having good, sustainable, blended communities, and the design quality of homes as the Minister's indicators. So that's another figure or set of figures, if you like, that we use to influence our thinking around whether or not the right housing supply is coming forward in the right places. So right sizing again is a good example of that, where we want to see those smaller homes in local communities because the community have told us that's what they want to see to enable them to right size in the place where they want to live.
I think that's pretty much answered my last question there. So thank you.
Thank you. And I suppose just wrapping up, Minister, I mean, you've made it very clear that you have a small focused budget that is mainly focused on policy, and you have your business as usual, your main elements that you need to be implementing next year before the elections, but the big thing that I suppose. And you've mentioned is, what does the future look like? And obviously the Invest in Jersey, and I suppose the Jersey Capital Investment Fund does mention housing as kind of the big thing why it's ring-fenced. It says ring-fence the required annual funding for housing. But we were just talking about the Housing Development Fund being, separate, the Andean funding being separate. I assume that means that's not going to be part of that. So just, and I know that the Chief Minister wants to set up this fund as soon as possible and start actually maybe even putting money in it early before the elections and maybe even, structuring it. So it means that you will be part of those discussions. And so you mentioned about it being, future political decisions, but of course you'll be one of the first ministers around housing to be discussing what that looks like. So when we're looking at this document about the Capital Investment Fund, it says ring-fence the required annual funding for housing. What actually would that be looking at within housing? What is it meant to be doing? What's the main funding that would go to?
Mm-hmm. So I guess I probably should have made the connection actually when you were asking questions about the state's bond, the 250 million, because I would see that as probably what the conversation would need to be about investing in Jersey. So the Investing in Jersey programme talks about supporting Andium and SOJDC. And I do apologise because I should have made that connection to investing in Jersey, that we have discussed it in that particular context. So the Investing in Jersey programme of itself relative to the Capital Investment Fund for housing won't necessarily translate into a drawdown from that fund for housing. No. It could relate to another fund. So I said I do apologise that I didn't pick up that connection earlier. But all of these things would have to be subject to a business case. So they haven't been, detailed proposals, a scale of funding hasn't been settled. I think the principle of housing in Investing in Jersey relative to the wider infrastructure spend is because they are materially linked. So you're talking about the dependence on our drainage infrastructure, for example, is that if we are going to provide more homes for islanders, we absolutely have to invest in drainage infrastructure.
Which I understand the narrative of that, and that's Invest in Jersey, but because we're talking about the money and what that fund will be spent on and which projects will go for, and because it says ring fencing for housing, that instead of ring fencing for infrastructure, that would help develop housing is a different narrative than saying it's ring fencing for housing. And so I just was wanting to see what discussions have happened around what the funding potentially could be for, and what does that housing funding look like? What is it? What would it be for? Would it be, in these elements that we've just been talking about?
So again, the total value would have to go to the housing need. We haven't recast our future housing requirements relative to the next island plan, which is where we reset our assumptions for housing supply and demand. So it's impossible to say where the difference lies between the financial capacity of Andium and SOJDC to deliver homes for government against what we would expect them to deliver in any increased or decreased housing demand projection that we might identify. So that number hasn't been rationalised yet, and it won't be rationalised until the work for the next island plan starts in earnest at the beginning of the next political term. So we can't set a number on that, but it would naturally form part of the business case if there's that difference between their existing financial capacity and what we would want to be supporting them to increase that capacity to deliver more homes.
So the
for
fund
owners.
itself would then be the place to raise that money to pay Andim and SOJDs or to.
Well, when I
provide-
say that the mechanics of it would be subject to Treasury, and the dwelling, the building fund would come into that as well. You know, that would be where would the money come from, and how it becomes available is a question that the Council of Ministers will have to be thinking very carefully about in terms of the source of funds and also how they're prioritised, as you've identified.
Okay, I think we no more questions. Scrutiny. Well, thank you very much,
Thank you.
Minister. We'll give you 5 minutes back of your time. Thank you, Natasha, for that. Thank